Let me know when the recording has started there, Dennis.
The recording has started.
Okay, everybody. Well, we're 5 minutes past the start time, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining, everyone, today. Couple of notes. First, we are recording the session. There are a number of people who asked that it be recorded to be available later. Hopefully everyone can see my screen where we have a draft that we're going to work from. I want to start with just a couple clarifications about kind of the work of the committee today and for the rest of the year. So first, Michael had some comments and maybe others had comments on the draft survey that we've put together. So our first on the agenda today is going to be to go through those comments and suggestions and see what anyone else has. Then we are going to set up a, probably going to use SurveyMonkey to develop a survey which will be on a link that the state coordinators will be asked to send to their respective states. As you know, the survey is we're going to use the results of the survey to determine which 2 or maybe 3 subjects that we're going to focus our white papering efforts on this year. The other major initiative that we're going to have this year, which I would like to have complete by WISPA Palooza, is the development of a very simple couple-page handbook on the 5 to 10 things that you and your WISP can do to raise the profile of your business and our industry at the state and local level. I'm going to be asking, since this committee is so large, I'm going to be asking for a small group of volunteers who want to be on a kind of subcommittee to do an initial draft of that this whole committee will then have the opportunity to review and provide input on. And our plan is that by WISPA Palooza, we're going to have a panel about what the state coordinator committee has done this year and discuss where we are and present, the high-level points of the white papers that we've completed, and also go through the handbook on the 5 to 10 things you can do to raise the profile of our industry. So with that roadmap, I want to get started looking at the tentative list of questions we have, and I also am going to put up here side by side the only other written comments or suggestions that I received, which are from Michael, and we'll start with that and then open up to see if anyone has any, other suggestions that need to be incorporated. So, Michael, are you on the call?
Yeah, I'm here.
Do you want to go? I think I understand what. Actually, let's just start with your suggestions here in red. So on 4C, eligibility of fixed wireless for state-level broadband grants and loans, including the consequence of federal awards on state awards. What type of situation are you talking about there?
I'm talking about how a federal award might determine whether census blocks or other areas are considered served or underserved, etc., and how that influences the states as to where they will award the state-level grants and loans. So the states are influenced by what the feds say, like for CAF2 or stimulus or other kinds of awards like that. So I was just tossing the idea out as a way to expand the question a little bit.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. So I'll just put over here, I want to make sure it's crystal clear. We're going to send the survey to a lot of people who have not participated in this call and some people who don't really follow all that much of this, and so I want to make the survey as user-friendly as possible. So you're really getting at, including the extent to which state-level grants and awards
Well, the word award kind of covers grants and loans. That I was trying to keep it simpler, but you can just say grants and loans.
All right, including the extent to which state-level broadband programs and awards are influenced by federal awards. Is that okay?
Sure.
All right, that made a lot of sense. So you're talking about SCADA here?
No, I'm talking about smart grid. Well, I guess it is SCADA, but it's more than SCADA.
Okay, so I think you're probably definitely onto something here. Just flesh out a little bit kind of what type of data information you're trying to
So
get
you're
at.
talking about, you're on the last item?
Oh yeah, sorry, oops, I missed your other one. That was a mistake.
That's okay. Which one do you want to talk about?
Let's go back to new D, responding to other companies' failures to fulfill award obligations.
Okay, so let's say an ILEC gets an award to serve an area, and part of the obligation is to provide 10.1 or 25.3 or whatever, and it's supposed to serve, let's say, hypothetically, 100% of locations in census blocks, and then a WISP discovers that in fact they're not meeting those obligations. What role would WISPA want to take on a state level or nationally, or what advice would we give to an individual WISP on how to confront the funder, not the provider, with this information? And the purpose of that would be to open up the possibility of WISPs getting awards to serve those same territories that were underserved by where the obligations weren't met. That's a pretty complicated little statement.
Are you saying like fail to meet a build-out obligation?
Yeah, or if they claim they've built it out, but in fact they're not providing the service that they're obligated to provide.
So it's really kind of like a state level post-award challenge process.
Yeah. And how would it apply to a federal award that's only within a state? You know, there might be the same issue.
Well, you know, I think at the federal level, or with respect to a federal program like CAF, that's not really something we want to get at in this survey, just because that you know, the FCC and the CAF process has been run by WISPA out of the FCC committee and kind of the Washington efforts. But I think that to the extent that there are state funding programs or the state is somehow involved in a challenge process, that is certainly within the scope of what this committee is supposed to be doing.
Are some of the states actually providing, I guess, some funding and grants and loans and things like that? I know Indiana at the current time has not been giving any of those kinds of loans and grants. So is that something that some states are doing?
Yeah, absolutely. Lots of states are.
So one is the state actually giving that, which is kind of one of those other ones. And then what you're saying is, if there is a state fund, is there a response or a process that you can go through to challenge said claims of meeting those failures, if any? And is that an issue that at the state level we can bring up or not? Would that be correct?
And I would hasten to add that we probably don't want to be making challenges on other WISPs awards, although we should consider that, but at least that wasn't what I was thinking about. I was thinking about in particular phone companies and cable costs.
All right, so I think let's add, and we don't necessarily have to wordsmith it by committee right here, but we want to add a question about kind of post-award challenge process for state-level broadband awards.
That's probably really simplifies it, but it does meet the needs, I think. We're just trying to ask if it's something that they want, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, well, are they,
Is this an issue?
is the responder to the survey concerned about if there is a program, how it works, A, or B, that there should be a program?
Bingo.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I'm not aware of any like state level grants in my state, but it would make sense that if the state was doing that sort of thing, that somebody would probably be taking advantage of it, and what you would do to stop them from doing that's an interesting question. And it's a good question to ask because the only way we know that it was occurring is if somebody expressed interest in how to challenge it.
Yeah, so maybe I'm thinking, you know, we don't have a question on here. We can add up at the beginning, are there any state-level broadband funding programs in your state?
Jimmy, this is Lon Welchel. You know, one suggestion as I read through these is if we had examples of each one of these points, a state that's doing an award, for example, or an example of where the pole attachment rights are defined, that we could attach to this, that would be helpful for people looking at some of these areas for the first time, because many states don't do these programs, and to have an example of where a state is effectively doing it, that would be helpful.
I think that is very valid, but I think in this particular case what we're trying to find out is what issues are important so that we can focus our efforts at each state level and know what they each state needs or what the WISPs in each state want. But I would agree that if they do, then yes, that would be a very good thing to get done on topic A.
One of the things that all I was thinking of is so when somebody reads this, they understand what's behind it. Here's an example of what it could mean in your state. But to your point, we may not have examples of each one of these to share.
A couple of things that I see that aren't on the list that might be pertinent to everybody are things like taxes, both sales tax and property tax, because those are going to be.
Hey, Brian, hold on one second. I want to finish out the topic that we were on, and then let me come back to you. So we're going to add a question up top. Is there any state level funding or support? And then we're going to add a, and I can wordsmith it a little bit later, and Michael, I'll share it with you, anyone else who's interested, something about this challenge process. And the next comment, Lon, you were...
Excuse me, Jimmy. Your question 4 that you just added is in a way it's a restating of 5C. If there is eligibility for broadband grants and loans, the question of whether WISPs are eligible or not is assuming that there are broadband grants and loans. So you may want to tweak those two together a bit. 5C and 4 and question 4.
Well, I think the question is there a state level program? Is that an issue in your state? If there is or is not, and then if there is,
secondarily, are WISPs eligible?
Right, and then or if it's not, then is there a challenge process if there is one? Maybe a C and then a sub.
Well, I had really added 4 there as a point of information, Michael and others, and you know, it would be interesting to just have a list. Well, we think that the following states actually have one of these programs, so that we know what the size of the universe is. And then, right, if people spoke up and said 5C is important to them, that to me presupposes that there's some kind of state level broadband grant or program that they want to get a piece of.
Not necessarily. In Missouri, there's very little, and it's more by a county or something like that. So there's really no state level broadband grant or loan that you can get. But it'd be interesting to say, yes, I think the state should have that. Is that the question we're asking, that we want to have that, or are we just saying if there is one, our fixed wireless operator is able to get to it?
Right. So we're remember, the point of the survey is to identify existing issues that WISPs face, and so that we can determine which of those are the most important for us to develop white papers about. It's not really to find out whether or not WISPs would like there to be additional funding programs for broadband in their state, because I can tell you without a survey that the answer to that question would be yes. So I want to keep the survey focused on, what are the existing issues out there that this committee can do some work and help you address, as opposed to what are some other things on the table that, as opposed to saying like, well, what else would you like there to be in the world?
I think you're right, and I think on 4, I think that needs to be yes, no, I don't know as option, and maybe even I don't know, how can you help me find out, or something like that.
Yeah, I agree with that, Stephen. I think we'll that'll be a survey design. I mean, a lot of these 1, 2, 3, and 4 are going to be yes, no, or type in the answer, and then 5 is going to be grab bag, pick these.
Okay.
All right, so let's move on to, I think Brian Webster was talking about tax issues.
Don't forget the I one.
Excellent point. Let's finish with I. So Michael, we'll go back to you and talk about I.
Okay, so there are lots of utilities across the country that are using frequency hopping spectrum in 900 and really messing up the band. And to the extent that that can be headed off in any states where that hasn't been deployed yet, in terms of addressing public service boards, public utility commissions, influence on the utilities, so that to preserve that the unlicensed spectrum, I think would be an important issue for many states. It's kind of a lost cause here, but I thought our experience with it drove my thinking about other states.
Okay, so by state supported, meaning like smart grid programs that are subsidized by the state, this, you're saying, are we trying to find, to the extent there are those programs in a given state, do we want, is an issue making sure that the strings on those programs include some reasonable protections for efficient use of spectrum? That's what you're really getting at?
Yeah, well, I'll just be really specific about our experience. There is one major utility in our state, and there are a bunch of little tiny ones, but there's one major one, and they had a choice to either use 900 megahertz or cellular spectrum for their smart grid system, and they got funding from the feds and from the state to put the smart grid in. They got approval from the Public Service Board to do the system, and they didn't consult with WISPs to see if the 900 was in use and significant. And after the fact, when the WISPs kind of, in their little herded cat way, gathered up and tried to fight it, it was kind of too late.
I think what Michael's also speaking to is that there's some advocacy that can be done in situations like this. I have a friend that went to the IoT, Internet of Things, smart grid stuff, and there are a lot of high-level power company executives right now very, very nervous because they didn't understand that deploying smart meters in 900 meg made them very susceptible to interference. So if there were advocacy at the state PUC or Public Service Commission level to talk about the technology that they're planning on deploying, the state, when they regulate things on the utility companies, they like to make them kind of bulletproof as much as possible, survivability for the consumers and everything. And they make the utility companies put in backup radio systems and phone systems for redundancy. And if someone had been there at the advocacy level, telling them, if you want these things to work, they should be using different spectrum because they don't have any protections there. And that could have had a benefit to the WISP industry. So I think there's a level of state-level efforts at the Public Service Commission or Public Utilities Commission for advocacy on any number of issues that could benefit WISPs if it's approached properly. Is that kind of what
Okay.
you're saying, Michael?
Oh, yeah.
So we're talking about, I just want to make it pretty simple, state level efforts to ensure that SCADA and other smart grid deployments consider incumbent spectrum users and spectral efficiency.
Yeah, that's generic enough, I guess, because it's going to be different state by state. So probably even more generic is just advocacy for the WISPs at the Public Utilities Commission for all issues. Very much like we do for advocacy at Washington.
Yeah, that would make a lot of sense. It kind of ties into other things like pole attachments and other stuff. If you can have the Public Utility Commission be familiar with you and be a little bit on your side, it really does help out with all sorts of issues you run into with these large, these are things that they regulate.
I guess it's not a bad idea, but I'm wondering, is it maybe too late?
In some states, some areas yes, and some areas no.
Yeah, we
so
don't have any.
that's part of the survey. I think I can wordsmith a little bit more here. We don't have to finalize it today, but this is a good concept, and I think the survey results will let us know if this is a high enough level thing that we should do some research and figure out whether or not it's too late. And I think it's a good idea to include this. And rather than take everyone's time and try and finalize the language for I'm just going to bracket it and try and find a good way of saying it. I'll probably recirculate this to the committee one last time for any text or wording suggestions. So in fact, I will be doing that.
So, Jimmy, one thing you could do is the same thing as you did with question 4. You could put it in the form of a question. Has SCADA and smart grid affected you, and do you want something done about it, or like that? So if you're trying to get an assessment of
oh yeah, that's a really good idea. That's a really good idea.
Has a state-supported wireless system / smart grid system affected your unlicensed band operations?
Yes.
Yes, of course.
Okay, so that's
that could also go into other things like smart traffic lights and camera systems and things like that on municipal levels.
Exactly.
Large municipalities. Basically, are there any state initiatives, state/municipal initiatives that are using unlicensed spectrum that could be pushed to other spectrum? I guess that's probably a good way to
I
word
like that one.
Yeah.
That wonderfully underused 4.9 band, right?
Considering all the money that they've probably spent, though, I mean, it's a wish list thing, but is it practical that every municipality is going to go back and re-spend that money, I guess is the question.
No,
No,
but
but
the impact
more systems
that
can
a
be
WISPA
deployed.
white paper would come out that would be best practices for municipalities, and we could share it. Again,
Yeah.
the point of the survey is to gather some information so we can figure out what to focus on. So I think tying this new question 5, which we'll wordsmith, with the new 6I makes sense, and so there'll be opportunity for everyone to nitpick the text one last time before the survey goes out. Let's move on to the next high-level topic. Michael, I think we covered all of your questions, even though I tried to skip it. Oh, no, 7. Would you like assistance learning how to influence the creation amendment? This is my suggestion with this approach, Michael, and the whole committee. I think we're going to plan to have a session at WISPA Palooza on the efforts of this committee and, white papers and what's going on. And I think that our first foray into question 7 is going to be, here is our handbook of 5 to 10 things that you can quickly and immediately do to get more involved and raise the presence. And I'd like to take up, getting more involved in kind of training training for state and municipal advocacy in the future, but not between now and WISPA-Palooza. I'm a big believer in doing a few things well as opposed to trying to do too many things. And if we open the floodgates too wide on this, we're going to get a lot of people excited and talking, but I'm concerned about how much we can actually achieve.
We go back to 6 and add taxes, both property assessment, and/or sales taxes. So
I've been trying to get back to you, Brian. What we're back in 6 now with your tax questions. What do you want to put on there?
Well, I mean, there are some states where people have mentioned issues of like their tower equipment being assessed for personal property tax, sales taxes on internet services. Those are going to be some specific state issues. I don't know how widespread it is state by state, though, so I think that probably should be a good gathering point of the survey. Both sales tax and personal property taxes.
I have one thing to add to that, too, after we're done talking about that part, after Brian's comment.
I mean, that's all I wanted to throw in on that. It's nothing specific other than it should be surveyed.
So then I think we would actually need, Brian, we need to do a kind of yes-no question up top about, are there state or local taxes that, property, sales, communications, et cetera, that are imposed on you? If so, which type? And then we would add the question, and as a sub-question in 6, help with state or local level taxation.
To go along with that a little bit, Jimmy, we've had, when I was on the Indiana State Broadband Committee here a year or so ago, it was brought up several times that various communities are starting to require various permits to allow, to put up equipment in different areas. And so there was a lot of discussion at that broadband meeting about having a unified permitting process across the state of Indiana, and I didn't know whether there was, anything involved with that we needed to be concerned about for WISPs or not across the nation.
And I second that. This is Eric Rogers. I was actually one of those involved with one of my local communities trying to come back and force us to file use permit changes when we were on grain elevators or utility poles or anything like that.
Missed you last week, Eric.
So
yeah, I'm sorry.
If we get all the way down into, well, the zoning administrator in Jones County state of the following state is a pain in the butt about permits, I think that's a rat hole we're never going to get out of. But I think if we, this is a big issue. We deal with it all the time. Actually, before I got on this call, I was dealing with a permit issue. So how can we kind of limit and narrow the scope of this permitting issue?
Cast the net, see if there's, the responses that come back, and then see if there's a recurring theme that might be able to be done either at the state or regional level.
Yeah, maybe just our local permits an issue for your WISP.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to add too, is to Section 7A is instead of just maybe obtaining utility pole attachment rights, even something with the easements, whether we could put in our own poles now that we're entitled to a telecommunications company or something like that. The only other suggestion I had is maybe instead of just having people pick from the 3 issues, maybe they can prioritize each of them, maybe like 1 through 4, 4 being very, very important. So maybe we can get a gauge of more like a full spectrum analysis of these issues instead of just forcing them to choose 3. Just throwing out an idea here.
Yeah, maybe the survey goes least important, most important for each one, and that way they can do a 1 through 5 rate on each one.
The other piece to this, though, is going to be that each change of regime, as I like to say, as they get new mayors or appointees, it's an educational process. So one thing that we learned when the state of Indiana was doing this, was that when that was pitched, that one county to another county could still have one city that's covered by two different counties. Half of the city, it was very easy for permitting. The other half of the city, every 500 feet, they had to pull a permit, and they were basically taxing them to death. So the problem was when the lieutenant governor was trying to put this together, because that was a common theme across the entire state, the state can't dictate anything. It's local only. All the state can do is come up with here's what's suggested, but you kind of do your own thing. And obviously if they're going to tax you out or permit you out, it's going to be slow growing, whereas the other community won't be.
Well, and that's where some of the PUC advocacy might be able to help circumvent some of that stuff on a state-by-state level. They create state regulation that exempts them, then it's, but that's getting deep in the weeds. It's definitely going to be a regional/local and/or hyper-local thing.
Jimmy, part of your goal here is to come up with a white paper that we can hand out to counties, whatever the subject is, to say this is best practice. This is what others in the country have done. It's a best practice. It's a white paper defining whichever action it is, whether it's poll attachments or other types of funding. But getting examples of what is working anywhere in the country that we can include in your white paper would be helpful.
Right.
Steve,
So
do you remember?
Here's the process that let me just go through. So we do this survey, and let's say on item 8 over here, we find out that an overwhelming majority of respondents say that poll attachment rights and state access to state-owned towers and regulation of VoIP, those are the clear winners. Then the next step for us would be to say, okay, on each of those three things, what type of white paper or document can we put together of general applicability across the country that will be most useful to the most number of states? So we might say, okay, well, a lot of WISPs are very concerned about poll attachment rights. So maybe we would put together a short white paper that says, well, here are the changes to poll attachment rights that result of our being classified under Title II. Here are 2 or 3 states that have got a really WISP-friendly approach and their legislation and why it makes sense. And so for F, state access to state-owned towers or other assets, we do the same thing there, Lon. Instead of, we'd say, well, here's the approach that 3 other states have taken that makes a lot of sense, and we'd have a white paper on that WISPs in other states could say, oh, well, you ought to do it the way that Maryland or Virginia does it, though you wouldn't want to use either of those states from my experience. That's kind of a follow-on. We have to see which of these issues are kind of most important, and then that's going to dictate a little bit the specifics of our next steps.
Good.
So let me just see if we're done on 8. Again, I'm not going to get all of the language finalized here today. So we're going to add, a yes/no question up top about state local taxes, and then a follow-up on that. We're going to add a top-level question about state or local zoning and permitting, and a follow-up question on that. Are there any other topics for the survey that people think need to be or should be included?
Do we want to talk about anything about things like regulatory or labor laws or OSHA type things that would be applicable to just about everybody?
I think that's a little, it's a little state specific and beyond the ambit of what we're going to be able to do well.
Okay, no problem.
The list looks good, Jimmy.
Okay, so here's what we're going to do. On the survey, we're going to make a couple changes as discussed. We'll flesh out the language. We'll plan to have that out to the committee hopefully tomorrow. I'm going to ask for a quick turnaround on that just so we can get this thing started. I've had a lot of people at WISP America. Alex gave us a lot of airtime in his presentation, so I want to strike while the iron is hot and get this out. There are some states for which there's more than one state coordinator, and so before this is actually sent out, I will be contacting the coordinators in each of those states and designating one person to be, to send out the email. That's our process on the survey. The next thing I will, by email after we get off the phone today, probably in the next week or so, I'm going to send out an email asking for volunteers to serve on a little working group to put together a straw man of our handbook of 5 to 10 things you can do to raise the profile of your WISP in our industry. I'll do that by email rather than over the phone. The next thing I wanted to discuss was that I've heard that some state and local level jurisdictions are beginning to point to the FCC's recent reclassification of broadband as 25.3 for certain purposes, and using that as an obstacle or barrier to things that WISPs want to do. And I'm going to send out an email. We have a pretty short email from Steve Coran about all of the different definitions of broadband that are out there. And so at Alex's request, I'm going to be sending that out to the members of this committee, who will have some ammunition if people are asking you about that, and just, for your own knowledge. With that, I don't have anything else on the agenda today, but I'll open up and see if anyone has any comments or questions about the work of the committee or our next steps before we adjourn the call.
This is Michael. Well, first of all, I want to say you did a really good job. This is a nice list, and I think it covers, all the things, all the key things that WISPs are going to be concerned about locally. But the point I want to make is that when you rewrite it, go through every single line, and wherever it says state, think about going state/local or state/municipal or state/county, because in some states the counties are much more powerful and influential on what happens than the state governments are. I'm thinking like Clay Stewart and his ongoing battles in Virginia have been all with the county and not with the state. And so you may want to make sure that local and municipalities and counties are covered in this general area.
I think that's a real good suggestion, and we'll do that.
Jimmy, a couple suggestions on 4A. If you could add obtaining utility pole attachment rights and access to public right-of-way. That might include Evan's point about planting your own telephone poles or plowing your own fiber. Another suggestion is list a couple of these under a category like barriers to deployment. What are the largest barriers to deployment? Is that going to be obtaining utility right-of-ways, or is it going to be state-level regulations, etc.? And another thing that I'm having a hard time articulating on is one of the challenges that we have in New York for obtaining additional grant funding is the service providers, specifically the wireline providers, overstate their coverage areas with their FCC 477 reporting. So I'm trying to figure out a way to flush that out to where we can call Time Warner or Charter out and say, hey, you guys don't actually have service even though you're reporting, therefore these census blocks are ineligible for grant funding. And I was just figuring out a way to articulate that in the questions.
So on the
Isn't
last,
what they said the challenge process was?
The ship has sailed on CAF and the challenge process, and so I'm hesitant to reopen.
I'm talking specifically state grant funding. Specifically in New York, there's a lot of areas where Time Warner has claimed that they provide services at a certain speed tier, where in fact they don't provide access to those census blocks that are listed in the 477.
Isn't that captured by new 8D here? Right, so or post-award challenge process for state-level broadband awards.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. That challenge process covered.
Okay, so it wasn't answered by when I started my sentence, but I think we've got it now. Okay, anything else for the good of the order?
Along with that line, I guess I'm questioning, can you separate state funds from federal funds? I was thinking about that earlier when we were talking about the challenge process. If the ship has sailed on the federal level, I mean, how much of that stuff, in a sense, trickles down? I mean, doesn't a lot of the state money actually come from something to do with the federal, whether it's USDA or something else?
Typically, the state programs are state funded.
Okay, so you're saying you can separate, you can differentiate, and that's why?
Yeah, and in the case that Jason's talking about, they've actually exempted parts of the whole state because it's already covered under federal funding. They're doing their own initiative, and it's separate funding, so it's not bundled.
Okay.
And this is speaking to the part I added to now 8C at the end where we're talking about influenced by federal awards. That's exactly what I was talking about before.
Okay, so I think we may not have a perfect survey here, but we have one that's pretty good for our purposes. So there are no other high-level issues. I'm going to adjourn this meeting, and we will plan to get a revised draft of the survey for written comment in the next day or two, certainly by the end of the week.
That's good. Great job, Jim.
Okay.
Perfect. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, everyone, for your time.
Bye.
Thanks, Jimmy.
See you all, yeah.
You guys.
Thanks, everybody.